The Grand Canyon is 5,000 feet deep. Every textbook says the Colorado River carved it over millions of years. But when engineers and geologists actually run the numbers on that claim, the math simply does not work, not even close. Before we dive in, comment where in the world you are watching from and don't forget to click subscribe. The Colorado River carries approximately 140 million tons of sediment per year. That sounds like an enormous number until you calculate how much material would need to have been removed to produce the Grand Canyon. The canyon contains approximately 10 cubic miles of missing rock. At the Colorado River's current sediment load, and accounting for the fact that harder rock erodes more slowly than soft sediment, the time required to carve the Grand Canyon by the river alone under current conditions would exceed the accepted age of the Earth itself. Geologists handle this problem by proposing that past conditions were dramatically different, that ancient floods moved with far greater force, that the rock was softer or more fractured in the deep past. These adjustments are made after the fact, introduced specifically to make the model work rather than derived from independent evidence and then applied to the canyon. That is not how scientific explanation is supposed to work. There is a second problem that receives even less attention. The Grand Canyon is not the only canyon of its type on Earth. The Yarlungsangpo Canyon in Tibet is deeper. The Cotahuasi Canyon in Peru is deeper. The Fish River Canyon in Namibia is the second largest in the world. Every one of these canyons has an associated river, and every one of those rivers is demonstrably too small to have carved the canyon it sits in. The Fish River in Namibia carries almost no sediment load. It is a seasonal stream. The canyon it supposedly carved is over 500 meters deep and 100 kilometers long. The accepted explanation is that the river carved it tens of millions of years ago when conditions were different. But there is no independent geological evidence from that period that conditions in that specific location were materially different enough to make the carving plausible. The pattern is global: massive canyons, inadequate rivers, official explanations that require assumed past conditions that are not independently documented. None of these adjustments are derived from independent geological evidence specific to each canyon system. They are derived from the need to make the model produce the right answer. When a model requires that much post-hoc calibration to produce a result that matches what you can already see with your eyes, the model deserves more scrutiny than it has received. Here is the question that the river carving hypothesis has never answered to any engineer's satisfaction. When you carve something by flowing water erosion, you do not get vertical walls. You get slopes. Water erodes the path of least resistance. It cuts downward and outwards simultaneously. The longer a river runs through a canyon, the wider the canyon becomes relative to its depth, and the walls slope outward from the base to the top in a characteristic V or U shape, depending on the specific erosion mechanism involved. The Grand Canyon does not have this profile. Large sections of the Grand Canyon's walls are essentially vertical. The Kaibab limestone at the rim drops in sections that are nearly perpendicular to the canyon floor. The Redwall limestone, roughly midway down the canyon, forms vertical cliffs hundreds of feet high. These formations are not the product of water flowing along the bottom of the canyon. They are the product of a removal event that cut straight down through multiple rock strata of different hardness and left the faces clean and relatively unsorted. When quarrying engineers look at images of canyon walls, the profile they see is not erosion. It is extraction. The straight-sided, deep-cut profile of a major canyon is consistent with an operation that moved enormous volumes of material out of a defined space, leaving the surrounding rock formation largely intact. This is not what rivers do. This is what mining operations do. The economic question the revisionist framework asks is direct. If the canyons of Earth were not carved by rivers but were instead the product of large-scale material extraction, what was being extracted, who extracted it, and what happened to the material that was removed? What makes this worth examining seriously is not any single canyon, but the consistency of the mismatch. If the river carving hypothesis were correct, you would expect at least some canyon systems to show sediment deposits at the scale the model requires. None of them do. This is the argument that separates the revisionist economic history position from geological controversy alone. The question is not just how the canyon was carved, the question is where the material went. 10 cubic miles of rock removed from the Grand Canyon. That material did not simply dissolve. Under any mechanical erosion model, including the river carving model, the sediment goes somewhere. It is deposited downstream. In the case of the Colorado River, the sediment should have built an enormous delta at the river's mouth in the Gulf of California. Geologists have studied the Colorado River delta extensively. What they have found is a delta that is far smaller than the volume of canyon material would predict, and that shows a depositional history inconsistent with the timeline the standard carving model requires. The same problem appears at every major canyon system globally. The Yarlung-Tsangpo cuts through the Himalayas and deposits into the Brahmaputra River system, which should show an enormous sediment load corresponding to canyon formation. The sediment record does not match the canyon volume. The Fish River Canyon in Namibia has no corresponding sediment deposit anywhere in its drainage system that accounts for the missing material. If the material was not deposited downstream, it was removed by a different mechanism entirely. A mining or extraction operation removes material and transports it away from the site in a controlled manner. The material does not appear in the natural drainage system because it was not deposited there. It was taken somewhere deliberately. The revisionist economic history argument holds that what we are looking at in the world's major canyon systems is the archaeological signature of large-scale resource extraction at a global level. The canyons are not natural landforms, they are industrial sites from a prior civilization that extracted something from the earth at a scale that dwarfs anything in the modern industrial record, and then transported that material away from the extraction sites in a manner that left no obvious downstream sediment record. When mining engineers look at canyon systems from an operational perspective, rather than a geological one, certain features that geology struggles to explain become immediately interpretable. The terracing visible in canyon walls in the Grand Canyon, the Bryce Canyon system, and several major canyon systems in the American Southwest, is conventionally attributed to differential erosion of rock layers of varying hardness. Softer rock erodes faster, leaving harder rock as shelves. But the degree of regularity in many of these terraced formations exceeds what differential erosion typically produces. The terraces in sections of the Grand Canyon are extraordinarily level, maintaining consistent horizontal elevations over distances of miles, with step heights that are strikingly uniform. Terracing of this regularity in a mining context is not surprising. Terraced extraction, sometimes called bench mining, is the standard approach for large-scale open-pit mining operations because it allows heavy equipment to operate on stable horizontal surfaces while material is removed from the face below. The terraced walls of open-pit mines around the world today have the same visual signature as the terraced walls of major canyon systems. The scale is different. The geometry is the same. The consistent orientation of canyon systems is another feature that extraction models explain more cleanly than erosion models. Rivers generally follow the path of least resistance, which means they follow the natural gradient of the landscape and tend to meander. Major canyon systems tend to be straighter than rivers in open terrain, and their orientation tends to follow geological fault lines and fracture systems. A mining operation would preferentially follow geological fault lines because fractures are zones of weakness in rock, making extraction along those lines far more efficient. The coincidence of canyon orientation with fault systems is cited by geologists as evidence that faults controlled erosion. In an extraction model, it is evidence that whoever made the cuts was following the fracture network of the rock for operational efficiency. The revisionist economic history framework that applies to canyon systems is built on a specific premise, that the global economy of a prior civilization, whether identified as Tartaria or otherwise, was built around the extraction and processing of materials from the Earth's crust at a scale we have not previously credited, and that the evidence of that extraction is preserved in the landscape features we have attributed to natural geological processes. This is an economic argument before it is a geological one. It asks what kind of economy would require the extraction of tens of millions of tons of rock from precisely defined locations across multiple continents simultaneously. It asks what that economy was producing with those materials. And it asks why the extraction sites show no evidence of the infrastructure, the processing facilities, the transportation networks, the waste piles that modern mining operations generate at every scale. The answer the revisionist framework offers is that the prior civilization's extraction and processing technology was sufficiently advanced that it left no conventional industrial footprint. The processing happened late and at or near the extraction site, using methods that did not produce the slag heaps, tailings ponds, and chemical residues that modern mining produces. The transportation was accomplished through methods that did not require roads, railways, or waterways in the conventional sense. The operation was systematic, geographically distributed, and conducted at a scale that has left its primary evidence not in industrial archaeology, but in the landscape itself. The canyons are the receipts. They are what remains when you remove what you came for and leave. The revisionist framework is not proposing primitive people with baskets. It is proposing a civilization with energy manipulation technology advanced enough that it left no conventional industrial footprint while moving material at a scale that dwarfs every mining operation in the modern record. The final layer of the revisionist economic argument concerns the history of how canyon systems have been explained since European science began studying them in the 19th century. The geological explanations developed during this period, the river carving hypothesis, the glacial carving hypothesis for canyon systems in formerly glaciated regions, the differential erosion model, were developed during the same century that the revisionist framework identifies as the critical window for the suppression of evidence for prior civilizations. John Wesley Powell led the first documented European-American expedition through the Grand Canyon in 1869. His published account of the canyon interpreted its features in terms of the geological theories current at the time, primarily the uniformitarian framework that natural processes operating at present-day rates over enormous time periods could explain any geological feature. The uniformitarian framework was specifically opposed to catastrophism, the older view that many geological features were the product of large-scale, rapid, catastrophic events. The adoption of uniformitarianism as the standard geological framework in the 19th century was partly a scientific development and partly an ideological one. Catastrophism had been associated with religious interpretations of geological history, particularly flood geology. Uniformitarianism was presented as the scientific alternative, but in excluding catastrophic processes, it also excluded any rapid, large-scale formation event from the acceptable explanation space. An extraction event which would be rapid, large-scale, and leave the kind of sharp-walled, geometrically regular features that canyons display was not merely unexamined, it was categorically excluded by the dominant framework before anyone thought to examine the evidence from that perspective. The revisionist economic argument does not require that 19th century geologists knew they were suppressing evidence. It requires only that the framework they adopted, for reasons both scientific and ideological, made a specific category of correct explanation invisible to them, and that their successors, trained within that framework, have inherited the blind spot along with everything else. The canyons of the Earth are the most dramatic cuts on the surface of the planet. The official story asks rivers moving at walking speed to have cut walls of solid rock thousands of feet deep and left them vertical. Something made those cuts. Whatever it was not patient. It was powerful, and it left the walls standing.